So back in 2019, I ran into some uphill battles due to differences in ways of life and not being accepted for who I was. I was living in Seattle at the time, and oftentimes I was working at a startup university. Unfortunately, they have since closed their doors due to all the uncertainty of the last couple of years. But at the time, I would often get the lousiest schedules because people thought that as a solo sexual guy, I could absorb it all. I would often have to fill in for my coworkers, and one of the most upsetting situations, and I say upsetting not that I was unhappy about filling in for my coworkers, but because oftentimes it went unappreciated. I had a coworker who had a house repair emergency. He had a toilet overflow or a pipe burst or something of that nature, and asked me to fill in to teach a class that I was not very familiar with. And the funny thing is, now looking back at it, I'll have to see if I can find the emails from, or whatever it was from back then, but he seemed very unappreciative of that. He just said, "This is an emergency, come in," and it didn't feel like he gave me a choice about the matter. I'll have to look at the email from back then. So I was, at the time, I was actually living out of my car. I used to live out of my car 8-9 months out of the year. Now, granted, a lot of times I did that because I would prefer to be spending the money on other things, especially the computer game conferences, especially various art projects that I was doing, especially, I'm an auto-romantic, right? I love taking myself out on dates, and some of the more elaborate dates can get a little bit expensive, right? And so part of the reason I was living out of my car was that. But granted, he asked me to fill in after I wake up from my car so that he can take care of a $2 million piece of property over in Seattle, right? That's the imbalance that I'm talking about, right? Now, and he's unappreciative of that. And he probably doesn't know that I live out of my car. He certainly knows that I probably don't live in anything near what he lives in, right? But my other colleagues accepted that kind of treatment because he's married, has 2 kids, I'm single. I was dating somebody at the time, but at the time I didn't really want to think about the long-term commitment involved. I was very nervous about spending time with my girlfriend because I worried one day we would get married and I would not have time for all the projects that I love as a single guy, right? I hate to think about it. To this day, every time I meet a girl, I worry that it's going to go on longer than I had anticipated. Now, this was in 2019. Fortunately, the events of the following year completely changed that, and I was once again happily single. I distinctly remember the first couple of weeks of the pandemic. At first, I was upset I couldn't see my girlfriend, and then I thank God that he separated me from my girlfriend, because now I was happier than ever. Up until recently, we still continue to talk, although I think she has met somebody else, and things have kind of settled, and so that's good. That's good. I got a lot of inspiration from her. She gets to move on. I get to move on. Now, the problem is that during the pandemic, even though I quickly moved on and became even happier, the rest of society didn't seem to see it that way. I continued to have to fill in for my colleagues. Now my colleagues oftentimes didn't have childcare. Their kids didn't have a school to go to. Oftentimes there was uncertainty. Oftentimes my colleagues had extended, I don't necessarily connect all that much with my extended family members. Some of my colleagues do. And then every so often one of their extended family members would get sick, and with COVID or with anything else, right? Or they would get sick with something else, and because everything was locked down due to COVID, right? They were dealing with grief and all that, and had me fill in. And then finally, when we get to resolving some of that, people were starting to resign from their jobs in droves, and I had to fill in for all that as well because I'm solo sexual. I don't have anybody to take care of. And it just drove me nuts. And then I watch on the news, and it doesn't seem to work that way in a lot of other countries. And I started to kick myself that I didn't leave the country. I used to travel a lot. I just didn't have the luck of being outside of the country when COVID broke out. That's the kind of luck that I'll never have, right? Had I been in Taiwan and I couldn't leave because of COVID, or had I been in one of the computer game conferences and I couldn't leave due to COVID, oh my God, I could have had the time of my life, right? So here in the United States, I can only imagine if we had a president who was solosexual, or even some kind of music superstar who was solosexual, right? I don't think Americans would take that very well. Actually, I can think of a couple examples. So everybody's wondering if Taylor Swift is dating this guy that she met a number of years ago, right? A lot of speculation and all that. But why? Why do we feel that she has to be with somebody, right? Let's see. You get the idea, right? Too much prejudice for how people have to live their lives. But in other countries, it doesn't seem to work that way, right? So on Polish Idol Season 1, second place winner Ewelina Falenta, she has never dated anybody. I don't think anybody has given her pressure to hook up with anybody. And she sings about romance. I know what kind of romance she is feeling. A lot of people here in the United States don't seem to appreciate it. So October 24th is her birthday. She turns 43 years old. And I'm thinking about going on some kind of a strike where I raise some awareness about working conditions for solosexuals. Now, a number of working conditions I want to set during this strike is the idea that so-called family-oriented workplaces don't just have to apply to a traditional nuclear family, right? So, for example, I want people to have a family-oriented workplace where they could feel they can go home to make their art projects, to write computer games, to go view a lunar eclipse. I want family to be families of everything, right? Not just other humans, right? Families with inanimate objects, your family with the solar system, right? Your family connections with yourself and with good eating habits. Oh yeah, I want people to stop pushing food on other people. If you say no to food, that should be the end of the story, right? And without having to explain why. Right? Nobody should be forced to explain that the reason they can't have your birthday cake is because of their health, right? Certainly not their, for example, I have to avoid a lot of things to keep my, I have high functioning autism, and you would not want to see me if I were eating a standard American diet. I'd probably be institutionalized if I ate like a lot of other people. But that's not necessarily something I want to share at work, right? I just want to be able to silently avoid the foods that will trigger me. And unfortunately, we don't live in a society that takes no for a good answer oftentimes, right? And some people might not be comfortable sharing religious issues on why they're avoiding food, right? Some people might not be comfortable sharing, I don't know, maybe they had a bad experience. Maybe they had a bad experience with a certain food at some point, a traumatic experience, right? I related in a couple videos ago about how my mom used to force feed me as a kid, and there are certain foods, not necessarily over health issues, but I still cannot eat to this day because of traumatic experiences. I think we all remember George H.W. Bush, who wouldn't eat broccoli. I can just imagine him as a child, his mom wanting to eat broccoli and forcing him to sit at the table, and he probably has trauma like that, I would imagine. It's not just a distaste anymore, right? And but a lot of people don't want to share that, right? George H.W. Bush certainly didn't go too far with sharing. He just says, I'm not going to eat it, don't deliver it here. That's the end of the story, right? I want more workplaces to be like that, not having to explain why you don't want to eat something, date somebody, get married. You know, nobody should be forced to explain all that, right? And so every October 24th, until those conditions are met, I'm going to go on some kind of a strike, right? Anyways, I hope you will join me this year.